Villages stood in cleared areas surrounded by fields and forests that extended beyond the cultivated land where people worked. The villages contained houses built close together along paths that connected them to fields and to each other. People lived in these houses with their families and performed the work necessary to maintain life in this place. The houses were made from materials gathered nearby and shaped into walls and roofs that provided shelter from weather. Fields around villages were divided into strips where different families grew crops during the growing seasons each year. The strips were separated by narrow paths or boundary markers that indicated where one family's land ended and another began. Grain was the main crop grown in these fields and required attention throughout the growing season until harvest time. The fields were worked by people who lived in the village and depended on the crops for their food supply. Forests provided wood for building and for fuel and also contained animals that could be hunted for meat when permitted. The forests were managed by rules that controlled who could take wood or hunt in certain areas at certain times. Gathering wood and hunting were done by people who had permission or rights to use the forest resources for their needs. The forests remained near the villages and provided resources used regularly by the people living in the settlement. Work in the fields began early in the morning when light allowed seeing well enough to perform tasks safely and effectively. Men and women both worked in the fields doing different tasks appropriate to the season and the crops being grown. Children helped with lighter work when they were old enough to contribute without hindering the adults working alongside them. The work continued through the day with breaks for rest and eating when the sun was highest overhead. Food came from the fields and from animals kept near the houses in pens or allowed to graze in common areas. Bread made from grain was the main food eaten daily along with vegetables grown in small gardens near houses. Meat was eaten less frequently and came from animals raised in the village or from hunting in the forests nearby. The food was simple and required preparation each day before it could be eaten by the household members. Houses were small and contained few rooms where families lived and slept and stored their possessions and food supplies. The main room had a hearth for cooking and heating during cold months when warmth was needed inside the house. Sleeping areas were simple and consisted of platforms or areas of floor covered with straw or other materials for cushioning. Storage areas held food and tools and other items needed for daily life and work in the fields. Life in the village followed patterns established over generations of people living in the same place using the same methods. The patterns repeated each year with the changing seasons bringing different work and different conditions to adapt to as they occurred. People knew what to expect during each season and prepared accordingly based on experience passed down from older generations. The predictability allowed life to continue without major disruptions except when weather or other circumstances caused problems requiring adjustment to normal routines. Morning began when the first light appeared and roosters called from their positions near houses where they were kept with chickens. People woke in their sleeping areas and rose from the straw or bedding that had provided cushioning through the night. The rising was gradual as bodies adjusted from the sleeping position to standing and preparing for the day's work ahead. Cold air filled the house during winter months and required moving quickly to start a fire in the hearth for warmth. Starting the fire meant using embers saved from the previous evening's fire that had been covered with ash to preserve them. The embers were uncovered and blown upon to make them glow brighter and produce enough heat to ignite kindling placed nearby. Small pieces of dry wood caught fire from the embers and burned hot enough to ignite larger pieces added once flames were established. The fire grew and provided light and warmth in the house as morning activities began around the hearth area. Water was kept in containers inside the house or was fetched from a well or stream near the village before morning tasks began. The water was used for drinking and for washing hands and face briefly before eating the morning meal and leaving for work. Washing was minimal and did not include bathing, which happened less frequently depending on the season and availability of warm water. The water was cold during most of the year and washing in cold water was uncomfortable but necessary before eating food. Bread from the previous day's baking was eaten for the morning meal along with whatever other food was available at that time. The bread was hard or soft depending on how recently it had been baked and how it had been stored overnight. Cheese or dried fish might be eaten with the bread if the household had these items in storage from earlier preparations. The meal was eaten quickly without ceremony as work in the fields required an early start to make use of daylight hours. Leaving the house meant gathering tools needed for the day's work from storage areas inside or outside the dwelling where they were kept. Hoes and rakes and sickles were common tools carried to fields for working the soil or harvesting crops when ready. The tools were made of wood and iron and were maintained by their users to keep them functional for the work required. Carrying tools to the fields was part of the morning routine repeated each working day throughout most of the year. Walking to the fields followed paths worn by many feet over many years of travel between the village and the cultivated areas. The paths connected different parts of the village to different sections of fields assigned to various families for their use. Other people were also walking to their field strips at the same time, creating a flow of movement from houses toward the open areas. Greetings were exchanged between neighbors walking in the same direction toward their respective work locations for the day. Fields appeared as long strips of cultivated land extending away from the village in organized patterns established long ago by the community. Each family had several strips in different locations rather than one continuous plot of land in a single place. The scattered strips meant walking between different locations during the workday to tend all the land assigned to that household. The system had developed over time and was accepted as the normal way of organizing the fields for cultivation by all families. Plowing was done in spring to prepare the soil for planting seeds when the weather became warm enough for growth. The plow was pulled by oxen or horses if the family owned them, or by human effort if animals were not available. The plow cut through the soil and turned it over to expose fresh earth and bury weeds that had grown during winter. Multiple passes were needed to break up the soil sufficiently for planting seeds in rows across the prepared strip of land. Sowing seeds involved walking along the plowed strips and scattering grain by hand in a broadcast pattern across the turned soil. The seeds fell where they landed, and some were covered by dragging a branch or board across the surface afterward. Birds were a problem during sowing, as they would eat exposed seeds before they could germinate and sprout beneath the soil. Watching the newly sown fields to scare away birds was necessary until the seeds had time to become established underground. Weeding began once the crop plants had grown large enough to distinguish them from weeds sprouting in the same soil. The weeding was done by hand or with tools that cut weeds just below the soil surface to remove them effectively. Walking along the rows and pulling or cutting weeds was repetitive work that continued throughout the growing season as new weeds constantly appeared. The removed weeds were left to dry in the sun or were collected and fed to animals kept in the village. Harvesting happened in late summer or early autumn when the grain had ripened and was ready to be cut and gathered. Sickles were used to cut the grain stalks, which were then tied into bundles called sheaves for easier handling and transport. The sheaves were stood upright in groups in the field to allow further drying before being moved to storage areas. The harvest was a busy time, requiring long hours of work to gather the crop before weather could damage it in the field. Threshing separated the grain kernels from the stalks after the sheaves had dried sufficiently following the harvest period. The sheaves were beaten with flails or trampled by animals to break the grain loose from the stalks holding it. The mixture of grain and chaff was then winnowed by tossing it into the air on windy days when wind would blow the lighter chaff away. The cleaned grain fell back down and was collected in containers for storage or for immediate use in making flour. Grinding grain into flour was done using hand mills consisting of two round stones with the grain crushed between them as one stone turned. The turning required effort and was usually done by women in the household as part of their daily work preparing food. Flour was ground as needed rather than all at once because it would deteriorate if stored too long after grinding. The fresh flour was mixed with water and salt to make dough for baking bread in the household hearth or in a communal oven. Baking bread happened regularly as bread was the main food eaten at most meals throughout the year by all household members. The dough was shaped into loaves and placed in or near the fire to cook until the bread was done and ready. Some villages had communal ovens where families brought their bread to be baked together, sharing the heat and fuel needed. The baked bread was brought back to individual houses and stored for eating over the next few days until more baking was needed. Animals kept by households included chickens for eggs and pigs for meat, and sometimes a cow or goat for milk if the family could afford to keep larger animals. The animals were fed scraps from food preparation and were allowed to forage in common areas where they could find additional food on their own. Caring for animals was daily work that included feeding and watering and ensuring they did not wander away or get into areas where they were not permitted. The animals provided food and were valuable possessions that required attention to keep them healthy and productive for the household's benefit. Pigs were allowed to forage in forests during certain times of year when they could eat acorns and other forest foods that fattened them. The pigs were watched to prevent them from getting lost or being taken by predators that lived in the forested areas. When pigs were large enough, they were slaughtered and the meat was preserved by salting or smoking to keep it from spoiling quickly. The preserved meat provided food during winter months when fresh meat was less available and when preserved supplies were necessary for survival. Gardens near houses provided vegetables that supplemented the grain-based diet eaten by most people in the village throughout the year. The gardens were small plots where families grew cabbages and onions and beans and other vegetables suited to the local climate. Women typically tended the gardens as part of their daily work around the house and in the immediate vicinity of the dwelling. The vegetables were used fresh during the growing season and were preserved by drying or storing in cool places for winter use. Preserving food for winter was necessary as fresh food was not available during cold months when nothing grew in the frozen ground. Vegetables were dried by hanging them in areas with good air circulation until moisture was gone and they could be stored safely. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were stored in cellars or pits dug into the ground where cool temperatures kept them from spoiling. The preserved foods were brought out and used as needed during winter when the stored supplies were the only food available. Cooking was done in the main room of the house at the hearth where fire burned for heat and for preparing meals. Pots made of clay or metal hung over the fire or sat directly in the coals to heat food placed inside them. Stews made from vegetables and grain and occasionally meat cooked slowly over the fire throughout the day until ready to eat. The cooking smells filled the house and indicated when food was ready for the household members to gather and eat together. Eating together happened in the main room with family members sitting on benches or on the floor near the hearth where warmth from the fire made the space comfortable. Food was served from the cooking pot into bowls or onto bread trenchers used as edible plates for holding the meal. Spoons were used for eating stews and porridge while bread was torn by hand and used for sopping up liquids from bowls. The meal was eaten without lengthy conversation as people were tired from work and needed to eat before continuing with evening tasks. Cleaning after meals involved rinsing bowls and pots with water and wiping them with cloths before storing them for the next use. The cleaning was done quickly as water was limited and had to be carried from the well or stream for all household uses. Food scraps were fed to animals or thrown outside where chickens and pigs would eat them before they could attract pests to the dwelling. The cleaned items were returned to their places and the household was ready for evening activities before sleep came with darkness. Evening work included tasks that could be done by firelight or by light from rush lights made by dipping plant stems in animal fat. Women spun thread from wool or flax using drop spindles that twisted the fibers as they hung and rotated below the hand. The spinning produced thread used for weaving cloth that would be made into clothing for family members when enough thread accumulated. Men repaired tools or worked on wooden items that needed shaping or fixing before they could be used again in the fields. Children helped with evening tasks appropriate to their age and size, such as carding wool or winding thread into balls for storage. They learned by watching and by doing simple parts of larger tasks until they could perform the full task independently. The learning was gradual and happened through daily participation in household work rather than through formal instruction given separately from work. Skills passed from parents to children through this participation and observation over many years of growing up in the household. Clothing was made from wool or linen cloth woven in the household or obtained through trade with others who specialized in weaving. The cloth was cut and sewn into simple garments that wrapped around the body and were held with pins or ties. Most people owned few garments which were worn until they became too worn to repair any longer and had to be replaced. The worn-out clothing was cut into rags for cleaning or was used as patches for other garments still in use by family members. Washing clothing happened occasionally when weather and time permitted the labor required to clean garments in cold water from the stream or well. The clothing was soaked and beaten against stones to remove dirt embedded in the fibers from long wearing without washing. Soap made from wood ash and animal fat was used if available to help clean the garments more effectively than water alone. The wet clothing was wrung out and hung to dry in the sun or near the fire depending on the season and weather conditions. Shoes were made from leather cut and stitched to fit the wearer's feet and protect them from cold and rough ground during work and travel. The leather was shaped when wet and dried to hold its form once fitted to the foot being covered by the shoe. Most people wore simple shoes that covered the foot but did not extend up the leg like boots worn by wealthier individuals. The shoes wore out from use and had to be repaired frequently or replaced when repairs were no longer sufficient to keep them functional. Sleeping happened when darkness made continuing work impossible without more light than the household could afford to maintain through the night. The fire was banked by covering it with ash to preserve embers for starting the morning fire without difficulty. Family members moved to their sleeping areas and settled onto straw-filled pallets or directly onto straw spread on the floor in designated areas. Blankets made from wool provided warmth during cold nights when the banked fire no longer heated the house adequately for comfort. Privacy was limited in the small houses where families lived together in one or two rooms without separate spaces for different people. Sleeping areas were shared by multiple family members, with children often sleeping together in one area and parents in another. The lack of privacy was accepted as normal since most people lived this way and had no experience of separate private spaces. The close quarters provided shared warmth during cold weather and created a sense of family closeness through constant proximity to each other. Night in the village was dark and quiet except for sounds of animals and occasionally people moving about for necessary reasons like tending to illness. The darkness was complete without moon or stars visible when clouds covered the sky during the night hours. People stayed inside their houses during the night as moving in complete darkness was difficult and potentially dangerous without light to see the path. The night was time for rest after the day's work and for gathering strength for the next day's labor in the fields. Morning came with the return of light and the routine began again with rising and starting the fire and eating before going to work. The routine was the same each day during the working seasons, with only small variations based on specific tasks needing attention that day. The repetition was not considered boring but was simply how life proceeded in the village where everyone followed similar patterns daily. The predictability provided stability and allowed people to know what to expect from each day as it arrived in its turn. Seasonal changes brought different work requirements as the year progressed through planting and growing and harvesting and then winter rest periods. Spring meant plowing and sowing, which required intensive labor to prepare fields and get seeds into the ground at the right time. Summer meant weeding and watching crops and maintaining the growing plants until they matured for harvest in late summer or early autumn. Autumn meant harvesting and processing the grain and preparing for winter by preserving food and gathering fuel for heating houses during cold months. Winter was a quieter time with less field work possible when ground was frozen and snow covered the fields where nothing grew. The winter work included repairing tools and buildings and doing indoor tasks that had been postponed during busier seasons when field work took priority. Animals required daily care regardless of season, and feeding them during winter meant using hay and stored food since nothing grew for them to eat. The winter was survived by using the food and fuel stored during the other seasons when these resources were available and could be gathered. Markets in larger villages or towns provided opportunities to trade surplus goods for items not produced. Within the household or village community, the markets happened on regular days and drew people from surrounding areas who brought goods to sell or trade with others present. Grain and vegetables and animal products could be traded for cloth or tools or other items made by craftspeople specializing in particular trades. The market provided social interaction as well as economic exchange and was an important part of life for those able to participate. Lords who owned the land where villages stood required payment from the people who worked the fields and lived in the houses built there. The payment came in the form of labor on the lord's own fields or in goods produced by the household during the year. Days each week were owed to working the lord's land before working on the strips assigned to individual families for their own use. This labor obligation was called corvée and was required of most people living in villages throughout the region controlled by the lord. Working the lord's fields meant performing the same tasks done on family strips, but the harvest went to the lord's storage rather than to the household. Plowing and sowing and weeding and harvesting on the lord's land took time away from tending family strips where the household's own food supply was grown. The obligation was resented but could not be avoided as it was part of the arrangement allowing families to live and farm in the village. Failing to perform the required labor could result in punishment or loss of rights to use the land assigned to that family. Mills for grinding grain were owned by the lord, and families were required to use these mills rather than grinding grain themselves at home. The requirement meant paying a fee to the lord for the use of the mill equipment and the miller's labor in operating it. Carrying grain to the mill and waiting for it to be ground took time that could have been used for other work needed by the household. The ground flour was brought back to the house for baking bread that would feed the family for the next few days. Ovens for baking bread were also sometimes owned by the lord and required families to pay fees for their use when baking. The communal ovens were more efficient than individual household hearths for baking multiple loaves at once using less fuel overall. Families brought their shaped loaves to the oven on designated baking days and collected them after they had been baked by the person tending the oven. The system ensured that the lord received fees for the use of equipment he provided while families got their bread baked more efficiently. Churches stood in most villages and required attendance on Sundays and on holy days throughout the year when work was forbidden by religious law. The church building was usually the largest structure in the village and was made of stone rather than the wood and thatch used for houses. Inside, the church services were conducted in Latin, which most people did not understand, though they attended and participated in the rituals as required. Failure to attend church could result in punishment from religious authorities who monitored compliance with attendance requirements strictly. Priests who served the village churches were provided with land and labor from the village community to support their living and their religious duties. Tithes consisting of 1/10 of each household's production were owed to the church and collected regularly throughout the year by church officials. The tithes included grain and vegetables and animal products which went to support the priest and to maintain the church building and its operations. The requirement to pay tithes reduced the amount of food and goods available to individual families for their own use during the year. Festivals marked important times in the agricultural year and in the religious calendar followed by everyone in the village and surrounding areas. Harvest festivals celebrated the successful gathering of crops and gave thanks for the food that would sustain the community through the winter ahead. Religious festivals marked events in the church calendar and provided breaks from regular work when people gathered for celebrations and communal meals together. The festivals were times of relative abundance when stored food was consumed more freely than during ordinary days when conservation was necessary. Marriages were arranged between families and involved negotiations about land use and property that would be combined through the union of two individuals. Young people had little say in who they would marry, as parents made decisions based on economic considerations and family alliances being formed. The marriage ceremony took place at the church, with the priest officiating and witnesses from both families present to observe the union. After marriage, the couple lived with one family or the other, or established a new household if resources permitted such independence. Children were born in the house with assistance from women experienced in helping with births who lived in the village community nearby. Many children died in infancy or early childhood from diseases and conditions that could not be treated effectively with available medical knowledge. Surviving children were valued for the labor they would provide as they grew and for the continuation of the family line into future generations. Children began helping with simple tasks at young ages and gradually took on more responsibility as they grew larger and more capable. Deaths were common at all ages and were accepted as part of life in the village, where disease and accident and hardship could end life suddenly. The dead were buried in the churchyard after services conducted by the priest who presided over the community's religious life and rituals. Mourning was brief as work had to continue and the living could not afford extended periods of grief that would interfere with necessary labor. The dead were remembered, but life went on for those who remained and had to continue working to survive in the village. Illnesses were treated with herbal remedies known to women in the village who had learned their use from older generations before them. The remedies sometimes helped and sometimes did not, depending on the illness and the treatment applied to the suffering person. Serious illnesses often resulted in death, as there were no effective treatments for many conditions that afflicted people in the village regularly. Prayers were offered for the sick and religious rituals were performed to seek divine intervention when medical treatments failed to improve the condition. Accidents during work in the fields or in other activities caused injuries that sometimes healed and sometimes resulted in permanent disability or death. Broken bones were set as well as possible and allowed to heal, with the injured person resting until they could return to work. Cuts and wounds were cleaned and bandaged and left to heal on their own without the benefit of modern medical understanding about infection. Many injuries healed successfully, but some became infected and caused serious complications that could not be prevented or treated effectively at that time. Violence between individuals in the village was discouraged by community pressure and by punishments imposed by the lord or his representatives when conflicts occurred. Fights over land boundaries or stolen goods or personal insults sometimes led to physical confrontations that required intervention by authorities to resolve. Serious violence was punished harshly to discourage others from similar behavior that would disrupt the peace necessary for community functioning and survival. Minor disputes were settled informally or through mediation by respected community members who helped resolve conflicts between neighbors. Thefts of food or animals or tools were serious crimes, as they threatened the survival of households that depended on their possessions and stored food. Thieves were punished by fines or physical punishment or expulsion from the village if their crimes were serious enough to warrant such measures. The community had to protect itself from theft and other crimes that would undermine the cooperation necessary for everyone's survival in the village environment. Trust between neighbors was important, and violations of that trust through theft or other wrongdoing damaged relationships that were essential for community life. Traveling beyond the village was rare for most people who spent their entire lives in the same place where they were born. Visits to nearby markets or to larger towns for trade purposes were the extent of most people's travel during their lifetimes in the village. Longer journeys were undertaken only when necessary for legal matters or for pilgrimages to religious sites considered important in the faith practiced by the community. The world beyond the village was largely unknown and unvisited by the majority of people who had neither reason nor means to travel far from home. Roads connecting villages to towns and to other regions were unpaved tracks that became muddy and difficult to travel during wet weather conditions. The roads were maintained poorly or not at all, depending on local resources and the importance of the route to those living along it. Travel was slow and uncomfortable, whether on foot or by cart drawn by animals over the rough surfaces of medieval roads. Dangers included bandits and wild animals, and the simple difficulty of finding direction and shelter during journeys through unfamiliar territory between settlements. Houses in the village were built by the families who would live in them using materials gathered from nearby forests and fields. Trees were cut and shaped into posts and beams that formed the frame of the house, supporting the roof and walls. The gaps between the wooden frame were filled with wattle and daub made from woven sticks covered with a mixture of mud and straw. The walls were not particularly strong but provided adequate protection from wind and rain when properly maintained and repaired as needed. Roofs were made from thatch consisting of bundles of straw or reeds laid in overlapping layers over wooden supports attached to the frame. The thatch was thick enough to shed water and keep the interior dry during rainstorms that were common during certain seasons. Thatching required skill to lay properly and needed replacement every few years as the material deteriorated from exposure to weather and time. Rethatching was done by specialists or by household members who had learned the technique through observation and practice over time. Floors in most houses were simply packed earth that became hard from foot traffic and from being swept regularly with brooms made from bound twigs. Rushes or straw were sometimes spread on the floor to provide insulation and cushioning over the hard dirt surface beneath them. The floor coverings became soiled and had to be replaced periodically by removing the old material and spreading fresh rushes or straw. The earthen floor was cold and damp during winter months when moisture from the ground seeped upward into the house interior. Furniture in houses was minimal and consisted of basic items such as benches and tables and storage chests made from rough wood boards. Most furniture was made by the household members themselves or by a carpenter in the village who made items for others when not busy with field work. The furniture was simple in design and construction without decoration or refinement beyond what was necessary for functionality and stability. Beds were often simply platforms or areas of floor with straw mattresses that provided some cushioning for sleeping at night. Windows were small openings in the walls that allowed light and air to enter the house during the day when weather permitted keeping them open. The windows had wooden shutters that could be closed to keep out cold air and rain when conditions outside made closing them necessary. Glass windows were extremely rare and found only in churches or in the houses of wealthy people who could afford such expensive materials. Most houses had simple openings without any covering other than the wooden shutters that could be opened or closed as needed. Doors were made from wooden planks held together with crosspieces and hung on simple hinges made from leather or metal if available to the household. The doors could be barred from inside with a wooden beam to provide security during the night when the household was sleeping. Locks were rare and most security came from the bar across the door and from the awareness that neighbors would notice unusual activity. The door was the main entry to the house and was used throughout the day as people went in and out performing their various tasks. Chimneys were not common in ordinary houses, and smoke from the hearth fire simply rose and escaped through holes in the roof or through the thatch itself. The smoke filled the upper part of the house before escaping and left a layer of soot on the ceiling and walls above the fire area. The smoky interior was uncomfortable but was accepted as normal since most houses were built this way and alternatives were too expensive or complicated for ordinary households. Eyes watered from the smoke, but people adapted to the conditions through long exposure from childhood onward in similar environments. Heating the house was done only in the main room where the hearth fire burned for cooking and provided some warmth during cold weather months. Other rooms or sleeping areas were not heated and remained cold during winter when temperatures dropped below freezing at night regularly. People wore multiple layers of clothing and used wool blankets to stay warm while sleeping in the unheated parts of the house at night. The cold was simply endured as heating the entire house was not possible with the limited fuel available and the inefficient heating methods used. Water had to be carried from wells or streams to the house for all household uses, including cooking and drinking and washing. Carrying water was heavy work usually done by women and children who made multiple trips each day to keep the household supplied. The water was stored in large ceramic or wooden containers inside the house until it was needed for various purposes throughout the day. During winter, when streams and wells froze, the water had to be melted from snow or ice collected and brought inside to thaw. Sanitation was primitive, with waste disposal consisting of throwing refuse outside the door or into designated areas away from the house when possible. Human waste was deposited in pits dug at some distance from the house or simply disposed of in fields where it would fertilize the soil. The lack of proper sanitation meant that smells were strong around the village and that diseases spread easily through contaminated water and living conditions. People accepted these conditions as normal, having no knowledge of better methods or of the connection between sanitation and disease transmission. Vermin, including rats and mice, lived in houses and ate stored food and spread disease without the occupants being able to prevent their presence effectively. Cats were kept to control rodents but were only partially successful in keeping their numbers down to manageable levels for the household. Insects, including fleas and lice, were common on people and in bedding and clothing and caused constant discomfort and scratching during waking and sleeping hours. The pests were accepted as unavoidable and people did what they could to minimize them without being able to eliminate them completely. Lighting at night was provided by the hearth fire or by rush lights made from plant stems soaked in animal fat and burned to produce a small flame. The lighting was dim and smoky and provided only enough illumination for basic activities that could not wait until morning, when natural light would return. Candles made from tallow or beeswax were expensive and used sparingly for special occasions or by wealthier households that could afford them regularly. Most activity stopped after dark, as working in the dim light was difficult and inefficient compared to waiting for daylight to resume tasks the next day. Maintaining the house required regular work to repair damage from weather and time, and normal wear from daily use by the household members living there. Thatch had to be inspected and repaired after storms that might have damaged it or displaced bundles from their proper positions on the roof. Walls needed periodic replacing where the daub had cracked or fallen away, leaving gaps that allowed drafts and moisture to enter the interior space. The maintenance was ongoing and necessary to keep the house habitable and protective against the weather conditions experienced throughout the year in that region. Building new houses happened when young couples married and needed their own dwelling, or when old houses became too deteriorated to repair adequately anymore. The building required help from neighbors and family members who provided labor in exchange for similar help when they needed assistance with their own building projects. The cooperative labor was essential, as one family alone could not complete a house construction without assistance from others in the village community. The completed house was simple but adequate for the needs of the family that would live there and work the land assigned to their use. Ownership of houses was complicated, as the land belonged to the lord and families had rights to use the land and the houses they built on it. The rights could be inherited by children when parents died, but could not be sold without permission from the lord, who controlled all land in his territory. Losing the right to use land and house meant losing the ability to survive in that location and having to move elsewhere to find new land to work. The security of tenure was important, and families worked to maintain good relations with the lord and his representatives to avoid losing their rights to the land they farmed. Community cooperation was necessary for many tasks that individual households could not accomplish alone with their limited resources and labor available to them. Plowing heavy soils required teams of oxen that might be shared among several families who took turns using the animals for their fields. Harvesting had to be done quickly when crops were ready, and neighbors helped each other to get all the grain cut and gathered before weather could damage it. The mutual assistance created bonds between families and reinforced the interdependence that characterized village life in medieval Europe, where survival depended on cooperation and shared resources. Work in the fields followed patterns learned through years of experience passed down from parents who had learned from their parents before them. The patterns varied slightly depending on local soil conditions and climate, but the basic cycle of plowing and planting and tending and harvesting remained consistent. Each task had its proper time determined by the season and by the condition of the soil and crops being grown in the strips. Delaying work beyond the proper time could result in poor harvests and food shortages during the following winter when stored food was the only supply available. Plowing in spring required waiting for the soil to thaw and dry enough to be worked without becoming waterlogged and unmanageable under the plow. The timing was judged by observing the soil and by experience, knowing when conditions were right for beginning the plowing work. Too early meant struggling with heavy wet soil that resisted the plow and exhausted the animals or people pulling it through the field. Too late meant less time for crops to grow before autumn cold stopped their development and reduced the eventual harvest yield from those fields. Seeds were sown after plowing created the prepared seedbed ready to receive them at the proper depth in the loosened soil. The amount of seed used was based on experience and on the available seed supply left from the previous harvest after setting aside grain for food. Using too much seed wasted resources that might be needed if the harvest failed and replanting became necessary during the season. Using too little seed meant sparse crops that would not produce adequately when harvest time came and the yield was gathered for storage and use. Weather determined much about how the crops grew and whether the harvest would be adequate or poor or failed completely that year. Rain was needed regularly throughout the growing season, but too much rain could damage crops or prevent field work from being completed on time. Drought meant crops withered and produced little grain even if they survived to harvest time in weakened condition from lack of water. The weather could not be controlled and was simply observed and endured as it occurred throughout the seasons each year without predictability or certainty. Prayers were offered in church for good weather and successful harvests that would allow the village to survive through the coming winter with adequate food. The prayers reflected the dependence on forces beyond human control that determined whether people would have enough to eat or would face hunger. Religious observance was partly motivated by the desire to secure divine favor for the practical needs of daily survival in an uncertain world. The connection between religious devotion and material welfare was understood by everyone and influenced how seriously religious obligations were taken by the community as a whole. Hunger was a real possibility if harvests failed or if stored food ran out before the next harvest could be gathered and processed. The hungry time came in late winter and early spring when stored food supplies were lowest and nothing new was ready to harvest yet. People survived on reduced rations and by eating foods they would normally avoid, such as bark or roots that provided little nutrition but filled empty stomachs temporarily. Deaths from starvation were not uncommon during the worst years when harvests had been poor and stored supplies were insufficient to last until new food became available. Disease spread more easily among people weakened by inadequate nutrition during periods of food scarcity in the village and surrounding areas. The diseases included fevers and digestive illnesses and infections that healthy people might survive but that killed those already weakened by hunger and malnutrition. Children and elderly people were most vulnerable and died in greater numbers during bad years when food was scarce and disease was prevalent. The survivors remembered these hard times and spoke of them for years afterward as markers of particular difficulty in the village's collective memory. Better years when harvests were good allowed people to rebuild their strength and to store adequate supplies for the winter ahead without fear of running short. The abundance was relative and even good years did not provide luxury or ease but simply adequate food without hunger threatening survival before spring. The good years were appreciated and celebrated at harvest festivals where the community gathered to give thanks for their survival and for the food that would sustain them. The contrast between good years and bad years shaped how people thought about their lives and their dependence on forces beyond their control. Work continued regardless of whether the year was good or bad, as fields needed tending and animals needed care and houses needed maintenance throughout all seasons. The rhythm of work was constant and unrelenting, with only Sundays and holy days providing breaks from the usual labor required for survival. Even during rest days, some work had to be done, such as feeding animals and cooking meals that could not be postponed entirely without consequences. The distinction between work days and rest days was less clear than it appeared, as necessary tasks continued even when other work was forbidden by religious rules. Daily routines varied little from one day to the next during each season, as the same tasks were repeated continuously until seasonal transitions brought new work requirements. The repetition was not monotonous but simply the way life proceeded in the village, where everyone knew what was expected and performed their roles accordingly. Change came slowly and was often resisted, as it disrupted established patterns that had proven adequate for survival over many generations living in this same place. Innovation was rare, and when it occurred was adopted cautiously after observing whether it improved outcomes or caused problems that made it inadvisable to continue. Tools used for field work were simple and changed little over time, as the same basic design served adequately for the work being done. Improvements were minor and incremental and consisted mostly of small refinements rather than fundamental redesigns of how tools functioned and were used. The tools were made locally by craftspeople who learned their trade through apprenticeship to experienced workers who taught them traditional methods and designs. Quality varied depending on the skill of the maker, but all tools served similar purposes and performed similar functions in the fields where they were used daily. Maintaining tools was important, as replacing them was expensive and required resources many households could barely afford when tools broke or wore out completely. Sharpening blades and replacing worn handles extended the useful life of tools and kept them functional for longer periods before replacement became necessary. The maintenance was done during winter months, when field work was reduced and time was available for repairing equipment that would be needed again when spring planting season arrived. Neglecting maintenance meant tools failed during busy seasons when their use was most critical and when there was no time to make proper repairs. Cooperation between households extended beyond shared labor for large tasks to include sharing tools and animals that not every family could afford to own. A plow and oxen might be owned by one family and lent to neighbors in exchange for other forms of assistance or for a share of the crops grown. The sharing arrangement allowed all families to accomplish necessary work even without owning all the equipment required for farming their assigned strips of land. The arrangements were based on trust and mutual obligation and were maintained through generations of families living and working together in the same village community. Disputes over shared resources or over boundaries between field strips were settled by community elders or by the lord's representatives, who had authority to make binding decisions. The decisions were generally accepted even if one party was dissatisfied, as there was no alternative authority to appeal to for different judgment. The system worked because everyone understood the rules and knew that defying decisions would result in punishment or loss of standing in the community. Maintaining order and resolving conflicts was essential for the village to function smoothly and for work to proceed without constant disruption from disagreements between neighbors. Social relationships in the village were determined partly by family connections and partly by the status assigned to different households based on their history in the community. Families that had lived in the village for many generations had higher status than newcomers who had arrived recently and had not yet established their place. Status affected how people were treated and what opportunities were available to them for improving their circumstances through marriage or through access to better land. The social hierarchy was understood and accepted as the natural order even by those at the bottom who had little power to change their position. Women's work centered on the house and the immediate area around it, where gardens and animals were tended daily throughout the year. The work included cooking and cleaning and making clothing and caring for children who were too young to help with other tasks. Spinning thread and weaving cloth occupied much of women's time when they were not engaged in food preparation or other household duties requiring immediate attention. The cloth produced was used for the family's clothing or was traded for other goods needed by the household from time to time. Weaving was done on simple looms set up inside the house or in a separate workshop area if space permitted such arrangement for the activity. The looms held threads stretched vertically while other threads were passed horizontally through them to create cloth of varying widths and patterns depending on the weaver's skill. The weaving was slow work that proceeded gradually as each pass of the horizontal thread added only a small amount to the growing cloth. Completing enough cloth for a garment required many hours of work spread over days or weeks depending on the size of the piece being woven. Dyeing cloth to create colors other than the natural white or brown of undyed fibers required materials gathered from plants or purchased from traders when available. Common dyes included blue from woad plants and red from madder roots and yellow from various flowers and plants that grew locally or nearby. The dyeing process involved soaking cloth in dye baths and then drying it to set the color permanently in the fibers being treated. The colors were not bright but were muted tones that gave some variety to the otherwise plain garments worn by most people in the village. Sewing garments from woven cloth was done by hand using needles made from bone or metal and thread spun from the same fibers used for weaving. The sewing held pieces of cloth together in shapes that formed tunics and dresses and other garments worn by men and women and children. The garments were simple in design and loose-fitting to allow movement during work and to accommodate bodies of different sizes without requiring precise fitting. Worn areas were patched and seams were resewn repeatedly to extend the life of garments that were too valuable to discard while still usable. Children wore smaller versions of adult clothing made from scraps or from cloth woven specifically for their use as they grew and needed new garments. Young children often wore simple tunics that could be made quickly and did not require much cloth or elaborate sewing to construct adequately. As children grew older, they received clothing more similar to what adults wore and they began to participate more fully in the work expected of people their age. The transition from childhood to adulthood was gradual and marked by increasing responsibilities and decreasing supervision from parents who expected children to learn by doing. Caring for young children was primarily the responsibility of mothers who kept infants and toddlers near them while working on other tasks throughout the day. Older children helped watch younger siblings and kept them out of danger while parents were occupied with work that required their full attention. The care was practical and focused on keeping children safe and fed without the attention to emotional development emphasized in later times and different cultures. Children were valued for their future contribution to the household and were raised to understand their role in the family's survival and prosperity. Elderly people who could no longer work in the fields or perform other physically demanding labor were cared for by their adult children who provided food and shelter. The care was an obligation expected of children toward their aging parents who had provided for them during their own childhood and youth. Elderly people contributed what they could through lighter work such as watching children or spinning thread or repairing items that needed attention but not great strength. The elderly were respected for their experience and knowledge even as their physical abilities declined with age and reduced their capacity for heavy labor. Death of elderly people was expected and accepted as the natural end of life after years of work and survival in the village where they had lived. The death was marked by religious services and burial in the churchyard near other family members who had died in previous years or generations. Grief was expressed but life continued for the survivors who had to maintain their work and responsibilities regardless of personal loss experienced through death. The dead were remembered but the living had to focus on their own survival and could not afford extended mourning that would interfere with necessary work. Inheritance of land rights and possessions passed from parents to children according to customs that varied by region but generally favored eldest sons over other heirs. Daughters received dowries when they married consisting of goods or animals or sometimes small amounts of land if the family had resources to provide them. Younger sons often had to leave the village to find work elsewhere as there was not enough land for all sons to inherit viable holdings. The inheritance system maintained family holdings intact rather than dividing them into pieces too small to support a household adequately over time. Marriage created new households or merged individuals into existing households depending on the resources available and the arrangements made between families involved in the union. Young couples might live with one set of parents until they could establish independence if land and house were available for their use separately. Living with parents meant contributing to the household's labor and sharing in its resources until the younger couple could support themselves independently from their own land. The arrangements were practical and based on economic necessity rather than on preferences about privacy or independence that were luxuries few could afford. Birth control was not practiced effectively, and families often had many children born over the course of a marriage that lasted decades if both partners survived. Many children died young from disease or accident, and the survivors were the ones who would inherit and continue the family line into future generations. Having many children was seen as normal and necessary to ensure that some would survive to adulthood and be able to care for aging parents later. The high mortality rate meant that large families were needed to maintain stable population levels in the village over time despite the frequent deaths that occurred. Childbirth was dangerous for mothers, and many women died during or shortly after giving birth to children who might or might not survive themselves. The deaths in childbirth were accepted as part of the risk women faced and were not considered unusual or particularly tragic beyond the normal sadness of any death. Women who survived multiple births were fortunate and were valued for their ability to produce children who would contribute to the household and community. Midwives who assisted with births had some knowledge and experience but could do little to prevent complications that arose during difficult deliveries that ended badly. Wet nurses were sometimes used by women who could not nurse their own infants due to illness or death during childbirth or other circumstances preventing nursing. The wet nurses were usually women in the village who had recently given birth themselves and had milk available to feed another infant in addition to their own. The arrangement was temporary and lasted until the child could be weaned or until the mother recovered and could resume nursing if she had survived. Infant feeding was crucial to survival, and communities found ways to ensure babies received nourishment even when mothers could not provide it themselves. Childhood lasted until children were old enough to contribute meaningfully to household work and could be considered young adults ready to take on more responsibility. The transition happened gradually without formal markers beyond physical development and demonstrated ability to perform tasks assigned to them by parents or other adults. Children did not attend school as formal education was not available to ordinary people in villages where literacy was rare and not considered necessary for the work they would do. Learning happened through observation and practice in the context of daily work rather than through instruction separated from practical application of skills being taught. Play was limited for children who were expected to help with work as soon as they were capable of doing so without creating more problems than they solved. Young children had some time for play between tasks, but older children were kept busy with responsibilities that increased as they grew and became stronger and more skilled. The play that occurred was simple and used materials readily available such as sticks and stones and did not involve toys made specifically for children's amusement. Childhood was shorter in duration than in later times, and children became working members of the household at younger ages than would be acceptable in different historical periods. Seasons dictated the rhythm of life in the village and determined what work needed to be done at any given time throughout the year. Spring was the time for plowing and planting when the soil was ready and when weather conditions allowed working in the fields safely. Summer required constant attention to growing crops and to weeding and to protecting plants from animals that would eat them if given the opportunity. Autumn brought the harvest when all available labor was needed to gather crops before weather could damage them in the fields where they stood. Winter was the time for indoor work and for repairing tools and buildings and for processing materials that would be needed when spring came again. The winter months were cold and dark, and work was limited to what could be done inside or near the house in short periods outside. Animals still required daily care and feeding even when other work was reduced by cold weather, making outdoor labor difficult or impossible. The winter was endured rather than enjoyed as people waited for spring to return and allow normal field work to resume again. Fuel for heating and cooking was gathered during autumn and stored for use during winter when gathering new fuel was difficult or impossible because of snow and cold. Wood was the main fuel used and was collected from forests where dead trees or fallen branches could be taken without requiring permission from the Lord. Cutting and splitting and stacking wood took time during the harvest season when other work was also pressing and demanding of available labor. The stored wood had to last through the winter or the household would be cold and unable to cook food properly until new supplies could be gathered. Cold during winter was simply endured as people had limited means of staying warm beyond wearing layers of clothing and huddling near the hearth fire. The fire heated only the immediate area around it, and the rest of the house remained cold during the long winter nights when temperatures dropped. Sleeping under wool blankets provided some warmth but was not enough to make sleeping comfortable when the house was freezing inside. Mornings meant waking in cold darkness and rekindling the fire before doing anything else that required warmth or light to accomplish saf. Eli. Darkness during winter months meant shorter days when outdoor work could be done and longer nights when little could be accomplished without good light. The early darkness meant ending work sooner and spending more time inside the house sitting near the fire doing tasks that could be done by firelight. Rush lights or tallow candles provided additional light but were used sparingly as they consumed resources that were limited and needed for the entire winter season. Most people simply went to bed earlier during winter and rose later than during summer when daylight lasted longer and allowed more work hours. Food during winter came from stores preserved during the harvest season and from animals slaughtered when cold weather made preservation easier than during warmer months. Salted meat and dried vegetables and grains stored in bins provided the main diet during winter when nothing fresh was available from fields or gardens. The diet was monotonous and lacked the variety available during growing seasons when fresh vegetables and fruits could be eaten along with grain-based foods. The monotony was accepted as normal for winter, and people looked forward to spring when fresh foods would begin to appear again as plants started growing. Spring brought renewed energy and optimism as days lengthened and temperatures warmed, allowing work to resume in the fields after the winter pause. The fields had to be prepared quickly once the soil was ready, as planting needed to happen at the proper time for crops to mature before autumn. The urgency of spring work meant long days and hard labor for everyone able to contribute to the effort required to plant all the strips assigned to the household. The work was tiring but was approached with enthusiasm after the confinement and relative idleness of winter months inside the house. Easter was the major religious festival of spring and marked the end of Lent, when people had fasted and abstained from certain foods for 40 days. The festival included church services and communal feasting and was celebrated with whatever special foods could be afforded by households that had survived winter. Eggs saved or produced by chickens during spring were eaten at Easter and symbolized renewal and new life returning to the land after winter. The celebration provided a break from work and brought the community together to mark the changing season and the approach of another growing cycle. Summer work in the fields was constant and demanding, as crops needed regular attention to ensure they grew properly and produced good yields at harvest. Weeding was ongoing as unwanted plants competed with crops for soil nutrients and water needed for growth and development. Walking through the fields regularly allowed observation of crop conditions and identification of problems that needed addressing before they became serious threats to the harvest. The work was repetitive but necessary and was done without complaint, as everyone understood its importance for the household's survival through the next winter season. Hay was cut from meadows during summer and dried for use as animal feed during winter when no fresh grass was available for livestock. Cutting hay with scythes required skill and strength, as the work involved swinging the tool in steady rhythm through standing grass for hours at a time. The cut hay was spread to dry in the sun and then gathered and stored in barns or stacks where it would remain until needed during cold months. Making hay required good weather, and timing was important, as rain could ruin cut hay that had not yet dried sufficiently for storage without molding. Midsummer was celebrated with bonfires and festivals that marked the longest day of the year when daylight extended furthest into the evening before darkness came. The celebration was partly religious and partly agricultural, marking the peak of summer before the gradual decline toward autumn and harvest time ahead. Bonfires were lit in the evening and people gathered around them for socializing and for celebrating the abundance of summer when food was plentiful and work was productive. The festival provided a break from routine and brought the community together for shared celebration of the season and its gifts. Harvest time in late summer and early autumn was the busiest period of the year when all available labor was needed to gather crops before weather damaged them. The work started at dawn and continued until darkness made continuing impossible without risking injury or missing crops in the dim light. Everyone, including children and elderly people who could still work, contributed to the effort to bring in the harvest as quickly as possible while conditions remained favorable. The work was exhausting but was driven by the knowledge that failure to complete the harvest meant food shortages during the coming winter when stored supplies would be the only source of nourishment. Cutting grain with sickles was hard work that required bending repeatedly to grasp stalks and cut them close to the ground where the blade could reach. The cut stalks were laid in rows and then gathered into sheaves that were tied with twisted straw and stood upright to continue drying. The sheaves remained in the field for days or weeks depending on weather and on when threshing could be accomplished by household members or by communal work groups. Bringing in the sheaves to storage or threshing areas marked the completion of the harvest and the security of knowing food was gathered for the winter ahead. Harvest festivals gave thanks for successful crops and celebrated the community's survival for another year with adequate food supplies secured for winter. The festivals included church services and communal meals where special foods were shared among families who had worked together during the harvest period. The celebration marked the end of the intense harvest labor and the beginning of the quieter autumn period when work slowed before winter. The relief and satisfaction of completing the harvest successfully was shared by everyone who had contributed to the effort that made the village's continued existence possible. Autumn work after harvest included processing crops and storing them properly and preparing for winter by gathering fuel and making repairs before cold weather arrived. Threshing grain to separate kernels from stalks was done using flails or by having animals trample the sheaves spread on hard surfaces. Winnowing separated grain from chaff by tossing the mixture into the air on windy days when wind blew away the lighter chaff, leaving grain behind. The cleaned grain was stored in bins or bags in dry locations where it would keep until needed for making flour throughout the coming months. Storing grain required containers that kept it dry and protected from rodents and insects that would consume or damage the stored food supply. Large ceramic jars or wooden bins with tight-fitting lids were used when available to households that could afford or make such containers. The storage areas were kept as dry as possible to prevent grain from molding or sprouting, which would make it unusable for flour or seed. Checking stored grain periodically allowed early detection of problems that could be addressed before significant amounts of food were lost to spoilage or pests. Vegetables from gardens were also stored for winter use by drying or by keeping them in cool cellars dug below ground level where temperatures remained stable. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots could be left in the ground and dug as needed if the ground did not freeze too hard. Cabbages and onions were hung in dry areas or packed in straw to keep them from rotting before they could be consumed during winter months. The stored vegetables provided some variety in the winter diet and supplied nutrients not available from grain-based foods alone that made up most meals. Slaughtering animals for meat was done in autumn when cold weather made preservation easier and when fodder supplies for winter feeding were assessed and found insufficient. Pigs that had fattened during summer and autumn were killed and the meat was salted or smoked to preserve it for gradual consumption through winter. The slaughter provided fresh meat for immediate eating and preserved meat that would last for months if properly treated and stored. Every part of the animal was used, including organs and blood that were made into sausages or other foods that extended the value of each animal slaughtered. Smoking meat required building smokehouses or using existing structures where meat could be hung over smoldering fires that produced smoke but not much heat. The smoke penetrated the meat and created a preserved surface that resisted spoilage longer than untreated meat would keep in storage conditions. The smoking process took days or weeks depending on the size of the meat pieces and the intensity of the smoke being produced. The smoked meat had a distinctive flavor and was harder and drier than fresh meat but was edible and nutritious throughout the winter storage period. Salt for preserving meat was expensive and not always available in quantities needed for preserving large amounts of meat at once for household use. Families that could obtain salt used it liberally on meat surfaces to draw out moisture and create an environment hostile to organisms that caused spoilage. The salted meat was packed in barrels or hung in cool areas where it would keep until needed for cooking and eating during winter. Salt was also used for preserving fish caught during autumn when cold water made fish more abundant and when preservation was possible due to lower temperatures. Preparing for winter involved more than just storing food, as houses needed repairs and fuel needed gathering and warm clothing needed making or mending. Checking the roof for leaks and repairing thatch before winter rains and snows came was essential to keep the interior dry and habitable. Gaps in walls were filled with fresh daub and doors were adjusted to close properly against cold winds that would blow through openings. The preparation work was done during autumn when weather was still mild enough to work outside comfortably for extended periods each day. Making candles for winter use required collecting animal fat and preparing wicks from twisted plant fibers or strips of cloth that would burn steadily. The fat was melted and the wicks were dipped repeatedly until enough layers built up to create candles of useful size and burn time. The candles provided better light than rush lights but were more expensive to make and were used sparingly for tasks requiring good illumination. Most households made only a few candles and relied primarily on the hearth fire and on rush lights for evening light during the long dark months. Spinning wool into thread continued throughout autumn and winter as an indoor task that could be done while sitting near the fire for warmth. The wool had been sheared from sheep during summer and had been cleaned and carded to prepare it for spinning into usable thread. The spinning was done with drop spindles that twisted fibers as they were drawn out from the mass of prepared wool held in one hand. The thread accumulated on the spindle and was later wound into balls for storage until enough was ready for weaving into cloth. Weaving cloth from spun thread was winter work that occupied time when outdoor work was impossible due to cold and snow and darkness. The weaving produced cloth for clothing and blankets and other household uses that required woven fabric of various weights and qualities. The weaver sat at the loom and passed the horizontal threads through the vertical threads in a rhythm that slowly built the cloth length needed. The work was tedious but necessary and was done with care to produce cloth that would be durable and suitable for its intended purpose. Children during winter spent more time inside the house and had fewer outdoor tasks to occupy them when field work was reduced by season. They helped with indoor tasks such as carding wool or winding thread or watching younger siblings who needed supervision and care during the day. The children learned by watching and by doing simple parts of larger tasks until they could perform them independently without adult supervision being constantly necessary. Winter was a time for learning and for preparing children for the work they would do as they grew older and stronger and more capable. Stories told during long winter evenings provided entertainment and education for children and adults who gathered near the fire after the day's work was finished. The stories included tales of saints and heroes and local history that preserved community memory across generations who heard and retold the same stories. The storytelling required no special equipment or resources and provided social interaction and shared experience during the dark months when isolation might otherwise have made winter more difficult. The stories were remembered and passed down and became part of the cultural heritage of the village and region where they were told repeatedly. Religious observances during winter included Christmas celebrations that marked the birth of Christ and provided feasting and respite from winter's hardships for households that had food. The celebrations included church services and communal meals and gift-giving when resources permitted such expenditures on items beyond basic necessities. Children received small gifts or treats that were special compared to ordinary daily life during the rest of the year when such luxuries were not available. The religious meaning of the celebration was understood and valued along with the social and material aspects that made the holiday memorable and important. Lent began in late winter and required fasting and abstinence from meat and other foods considered luxuries during the 40 days before Easter arrived. The fasting was difficult during late winter when food supplies were lowest and hunger was already a problem for many households struggling to survive. The religious requirement to fast was observed despite the hardship, as failure to observe Lent properly was considered sinful and could result in punishment from church authorities. The fasting ended at Easter with celebration and feasting and relief that winter was ending and spring was approaching with its promise of renewed food supplies. Late winter was the hardest time of year when stored food was running low and when nothing new was available from fields that remained frozen. Households rationed their remaining supplies carefully to make them last until spring, when fresh foods would begin to appear and relieve the scarcity. Hunger was common during these weeks, and deaths from starvation or from diseases affecting weakened bodies occurred more frequently than during other times of the year. The survivors looked forward desperately to spring and to the end of the hungry time that tested their endurance and their will to continue through difficult conditions. Snow during winter made travel difficult and isolated villages from each other and from towns where markets and other services were located regularly. The isolation meant that households had to be self-sufficient during winter months when help from outside was not available easily or quickly if needed. Medical emergencies or other crises had to be managed with local resources and knowledge, as traveling for help was dangerous or impossible during severe weather. The isolation was accepted as part of winter life, and people prepared as well as they could for managing on their own until spring made travel and outside contact possible again. Spring's return was marked by melting snow and by the appearance of the first green shoots pushing through soil that had been frozen for months. The greening of the landscape brought hope and renewed energy to people who had endured winter's cold and darkness and limited food supplies. The warming temperatures allowed outdoor work to resume after the long period when such work was impossible or extremely difficult to accomplish safely. The transition from winter to spring happened gradually over weeks as the sun climbed higher and days lengthened noticeably with each passing week. Early spring work focused on preparing fields for planting as soon as soil conditions allowed plowing to begin without creating problems from working wet ground. Judging when the soil was ready required experience and knowledge passed down through generations of farmers who had learned the right timing. Starting too early meant struggling with heavy wet soil that resisted the plow and produced poor seedbeds for planting crops successfully. Waiting too long meant losing precious growing days and risking that crops would not mature fully before autumn cold stopped their development. Plowing in spring broke up soil that had compacted during winter and exposed fresh earth for planting seeds in rows across the prepared field strips. The work was hard and required strong animals or multiple people pulling the plow through resistant soil that had not been worked for months. The plowed furrows created patterns across the fields that would guide planting and later cultivation work during the growing season ahead. Completing the plowing on time was essential for the household's survival, as delays could reduce harvest yields significantly and create food shortages during the next winter. Sowing seeds followed plowing and had to be completed within a narrow window when soil moisture and temperature were right for germination and growth. The seeds were broadcast by hand in sweeping motions that scattered them across the plowed strips in patterns meant to achieve even distribution. Covering the seeds with soil protected them from birds and helped them make contact with moisture needed for germination to begin underground. The sowing was done quickly to take advantage of favorable conditions that might not last long if weather changed unexpectedly during the planting period. Germination occurred days or weeks after sowing depending on soil temperature and moisture and on the type of seed planted in that field strip. The first shoots appeared above the soil surface and grew slowly as roots established themselves underground and gathered nutrients and water from the surrounding soil. Watching for germination allowed farmers to assess whether seeding had been successful and whether replanting would be necessary in areas where seeds failed to sprout. Most seeds germinated successfully, but some areas always required attention and possible replanting if gaps were too large to ignore without affecting overall yield. Weeding began as soon as crop plants were large enough to distinguish from weeds that sprouted at the same time in the disturbed soil. Early weeding was important as it prevented weeds from establishing deep roots and competing effectively with crops for limited resources available in the soil. The weeding was done by hand or with hoes that cut weeds just below the surface and left them to die in the sun. The work proceeded row by row along the length of each strip assigned to the household and continued throughout the growing season as new weeds constantly appeared. Summer work maintained the crops as they grew and developed toward maturity that would come in late summer when harvest could begin. The maintenance included continued weeding and occasional watering during dry periods if water could be carried or diverted from streams to the fields needing it. Watching for pest damage or disease signs allowed early intervention when problems could still be managed before they spread and caused serious losses. The watching was constant during summer as conditions could change quickly and require immediate response to prevent damage to developing crops in the field. Haymaking during summer provided fodder for animals that would need feeding during the next winter when no fresh grass was available for grazing animals. Cutting hay with sides required skill developed through years of practice swinging the long blade through standing grass in smooth, steady strokes. The cut hay was spread to dry in the sun and turned periodically to ensure all parts dried evenly before being gathered for storage. Weather during haymaking was critical as rain could ruin cut hay and force farmers to cut again if time and grass supply permitted such recovery. Storing hay in barns or stacks protected it from weather that would cause mold and spoilage if the hay remained exposed to rain and moisture after drying. The stored hay had to remain dry or it would heat internally and could even catch fire from spontaneous combustion caused by bacterial activity in damp hay. Checking stored hay for heating was done regularly during the first weeks after storage when the risk was highest and when intervention could prevent losses. The hay represented winter survival for animals, and its loss would mean animals starving or being sold because they could not be fed adequately until spring. Late summer brought the beginning of harvest season when grain had ripened and turned golden in the fields waiting to be cut and gathered. The timing of harvest was critical as grain left too long could fall from the stalks or could be damaged by storms that came through the area. Cutting began when the grain was judged ready based on color and on testing kernels by biting them to feel their hardness and moisture content. The cutting proceeded quickly once started as all available labor was mobilized to complete the harvest before conditions could deteriorate and threaten the year's food supply. Gathering sheaves from the field and transporting them to threshing areas or to storage locations occupied days or weeks depending on the size of the harvest and the labor available. The sheaves were heavy and awkward to carry and required multiple trips between field and storage to move the entire harvest from where it grew. Carts pulled by animals helped move larger quantities when such equipment was available to households that owned or could borrow it from neighbors. The transportation continued until all sheaves were under cover and protected from weather that could damage them before threshing could be completed. Threshing separated grain from stalks and was done by beating sheaves with flails or by having animals walk over them on hard surfaces where grain would fall free. The work was dusty and tiring but was necessary to extract the grain from the straw that had supported it during growth in the field. The threshed grain and chaff mixture was collected and set aside for winnowing when wind conditions were favorable for separating the two components effectively. The straw that remained after threshing was saved for animal bedding and for various other uses around the household and village where such material was needed. Winnowing on windy days separated grain from chaff by tossing the mixture into moving air that blew the lighter chaff away while heavier grain fell back down. The winnowing was done outdoors in open areas where wind could blow freely without obstruction from buildings or trees that would disrupt airflow. Multiple passes through the winnowing process produced increasingly clean grain that was ready for storage or for immediate grinding into flour for bread making. The winnowed grain represented the household's food security for the coming year and was treated with appropriate care during handling and storage after cleaning. Celebrating harvest completion brought the community together to give thanks for successful crops and to share in the abundance of the season before winter. The celebration included religious services acknowledging divine assistance and communal feasting where special foods were prepared and shared among families who had worked together. The festival marked the transition from the intense labor of harvest to the quieter work of autumn when preparation for winter became the focus of household efforts. The relief and satisfaction of completing another harvest successfully was felt by everyone who had contributed to the work that made survival possible for another year. Autumn preparation for winter began immediately after harvest as there was limited time before cold weather arrived and made outdoor work difficult. Repairing buildings and gathering fuel and making warm clothing occupied the weeks between harvest and the onset of winter cold that would confine people indoors. The preparation was essential as households that failed to prepare adequately would suffer during winter months when correcting deficiencies was impossible or extremely difficult. The work was done methodically and thoroughly as experience had taught the importance of being ready before winter's arrival made readiness no longer achievable through effort alone. Daily routines during autumn followed patterns similar to other seasons but with different specific tasks appropriate to the time of year and the work needed. Morning began with the same rising and fire starting and eating before going out to the day's work in fields or around the house. The work differed from summer work as fields no longer required the constant attention needed during the growing season when crops were developing. The autumn work focused on completing the harvest and on preparing for winter rather than on maintaining growing crops in the ground. Processing harvested crops occupied much of the autumn work period as grain needed threshing and cleaning and vegetables needed storing or preserving for winter. The processing was time-consuming but necessary to make the harvest usable as food during the months ahead when nothing fresh would be available. Each type of crop required different handling and different storage conditions to keep it in edible condition until it could be consumed by the household. The processing knowledge was passed between generations and was learned through participation in the work from childhood onward in the household and community. Drying vegetables preserved them for winter storage by removing moisture that would otherwise cause spoilage during the months between harvest and consumption. Beans and peas were dried on their vines or were picked and spread to dry in sunny areas where air circulation helped moisture evaporate from the seeds. Root vegetables were stored fresh in cool cellars where low temperatures slowed deterioration and kept them edible for months after digging them from the garden. The preservation methods were simple but effective when done properly and when storage conditions remained stable throughout the storage period until spring arrived. Apples from trees near the village were gathered and either eaten fresh or stored in cool dark places where they would keep for weeks or months. Some apples were dried by cutting them into thin slices and letting them dry in the sun or near the fire until moisture was gone. The dried apples could be stored for long periods and were eaten as snacks or were cooked into dishes that provided some sweetness during winter. Fruit was a valued addition to the diet and was consumed when available, though it was never as central to meals as grain-based foods were throughout the year. Nuts gathered from forest provided concentrated nutrition and could be stored easily for winter use without requiring preservation beyond keeping them dry and away from rodents. Hazelnuts and chestnuts and walnuts were collected when they fell from trees during autumn and were brought back to the village in baskets. The nuts were shelled as needed and eaten raw or cooked depending on the type and on personal preference for how they were consumed. Gathering nuts was often done by children who could collect them without needing the strength required for heavier work in the fields. Mushrooms growing in forests during autumn were gathered by people knowledgeable about which types were safe to eat and which were poisonous and should be avoided. The edible mushrooms were cooked and eaten fresh or were dried for storage and later used during winter when they added flavor to soups and stews. Knowledge of mushrooms was passed down carefully as mistakes could be fatal if poisonous types were confused with edible ones that looked similar. Only experienced foragers gathered mushrooms and taught others slowly over years of supervised collecting before they were trusted to gather mushrooms independently without supervision. Fish from rivers and streams were caught during autumn when water levels were lower and fish were concentrated in smaller areas, making them easier to catch. Nets and traps and lines with hooks were used depending on the location and the type of fish being sought for food. The caught fish were eaten fresh or were preserved by smoking or salting for later use when fresh fish were not available during winter. Fishing provided variety in the diet and was done when time allowed and when other work was not pressing for immediate attention and completion. Hunting in forests during autumn brought meat to households that had rights to hunt or that participated in communal hunts organized by the lord or his representatives. Deer and wild boar and smaller animals were hunted using dogs and weapons appropriate for the size of the prey being pursued through the forest. Successful hunts provided meat that was divided among participants or was given to the lord depending on the type of hunt and the rules governing it. The meat was preserved or eaten fresh and represented a valuable addition to the household's food supplies for the winter ahead when meat was otherwise scarce. Firewood gathering continued throughout autumn as households worked to accumulate supplies sufficient for heating and cooking through the entire winter season ahead. Dead wood from forests was collected and brought back to the village where it was cut and split to appropriate sizes for burning in hearths. Green wood was avoided as it would not burn well and would produce excessive smoke without providing adequate heat for cooking or warming. Stacking firewood in dry locations protected it from rain and snow and ensured it would be ready to burn when needed during cold months to come. Repairing roofs before winter rains and snows began was important work that prevented water damage to house interiors and to stored food and possessions inside. Thatch that had deteriorated during the previous year was replaced with fresh bundles secured properly to keep them in place during storms that would come. Checking the entire roof for weak spots allowed repairs to be made before problems became serious and required more extensive work to fix properly. The roof maintenance was done while weather was still mild enough to work outside comfortably for the hours needed to complete the necessary repairs thoroughly. Checking walls for gaps where daub had fallen away exposed the wattle structure underneath and allowed cold air and moisture to enter the house interior. Fresh daub made from mud and straw and dung was mixed and pressed into the gaps to fill them and restore the wall's protective function. The daub needed time to dry before cold weather arrived, but autumn usually provided enough dry days for the repairs to set properly before winter. Maintaining walls was ongoing work that was never completely finished as weather and time constantly created new gaps requiring attention and repair throughout the year. Doors and shutters were checked to ensure they closed properly and kept cold air out during winter when heating the house interior was important for comfort and survival. Leather hinges that had worn or broken were replaced and wooden parts that had warped were planed or adjusted to fit correctly in their frames. The adjustments were minor but made significant differences in how well the house retained heat when fire was burning in the hearth during cold weather. Properly functioning doors and shutters meant less fuel was needed to keep the house warm and more stored wood would last through the entire winter season until spring. Clothing for winter was checked and repaired, or new garments were made if needed to replace items too worn to provide adequate warmth during cold months. Wool garments were particularly important as wool provided insulation even when damp and was warmer than linen, which was better suited for summer wear. Sewing and mending occupied evening hours when light was available and when hands could work on the detailed tasks required for repairing clothing adequately. Children who had grown needed larger garments and received either new clothing made for them or hand-me-downs from older siblings who had outgrown them earlier. Blankets for sleeping were checked and repaired, or new ones were woven if household resources permitted such investment of time and materials in producing them. Additional blankets meant warmer sleeping and less suffering during the coldest nights when the unheated house interior approached outside temperatures that often fell well below freezing. Families with inadequate blankets suffered more during winter and looked forward desperately to spring when warming temperatures made sleeping more comfortable without requiring so many layers for warmth. The making of blankets was time-consuming but was worthwhile for the comfort they provided during the long, cold months of each winter season. Stockpiling food for winter meant assessing what had been stored and determining if quantities were adequate for the household to survive until spring brought fresh food. Households with insufficient stores faced difficult choices about rationing and about possible sources of additional food before winter made obtaining it impossible. Borrowing from neighbors or from the Lord's stores was possible but created debts that would need to be repaid later when the household could spare resources. The assessment was done carefully and honestly, as mistakes could mean starvation during late winter when stored food ran out before new supplies became available in spring. Winter's arrival brought an end to most outdoor work and confined people to their houses except for necessary tasks that could not be postponed. The confinement was accepted as part of the yearly cycle, and people adapted their activities to suit the limitations imposed by cold and darkness. Indoor work continued throughout winter as there were always tasks that needed doing regardless of the season or the weather conditions outside. The pace of work slowed during winter but never stopped completely, as maintaining the household required ongoing effort throughout the entire year. Animals required daily care during winter even when other work was reduced by cold weather, making outdoor labor difficult or impossible. Feeding animals meant bringing stored hay and grain to where they were kept in barns or shelters near the houses where families lived. Water had to be provided by breaking ice in troughs or by carrying water from wells that had not frozen completely solid during cold periods. The animal care took time each day but was necessary to keep the animals alive until spring, when they could graze again and when they would be needed for plowing and for producing milk or meat. Chickens kept near houses required feeding daily with grain or scraps from food preparation that would otherwise be wasted if not consumed. The chickens provided eggs during winter, though production decreased when cold weather and shorter days reduced their laying frequency significantly compared to warmer months. The eggs were valuable and were consumed when laid or were stored for short periods before use in cooking or baking bread and other foods. Checking for eggs was part of the daily routine and was usually done by children who could accomplish this task without requiring adult supervision or assistance. Milking cows or goats happened twice daily if the household kept such animals and if they were producing milk during winter months. Many animals stopped producing milk during cold months and would not resume until spring, when they gave birth to young and lactation began again. The milk was consumed fresh or was made into cheese that could be stored for longer periods without spoiling as quickly as fresh milk did in storage. Having milk during winter was fortunate and provided nutrition not available to households without milk-producing animals in their care during the cold months. Spinning thread continued during winter evenings as women sat near the fire and worked on producing thread for later weaving into cloth. The spinning was social as well as productive and allowed conversation while hands performed the familiar motions of drawing out and twisting fibers into usable thread. The accumulating thread represented progress toward having cloth for clothing and other household needs that required woven fabric in their construction. Winter was an ideal time for spinning as the work could be done indoors by firelight without requiring the daylight needed for outdoor work or for detailed sewing tasks. Weaving occupied days during winter when light was adequate for seeing the work clearly enough to produce good cloth without mistakes or irregularities. The weaving proceeded slowly as each pass of the horizontal thread through the vertical threads added only a small increment to the growing cloth length. Completing enough cloth for a garment required many hours of work spread over days or weeks depending on the width and length needed for the intended use. The weaver worked steadily when conditions permitted and stopped when light faded or when other tasks required attention that could not be postponed until later. Carving wood or bone into useful objects occupied men during winter when field work was impossible and when indoor work could be done by firelight. Spoons and bowls and tool handles were shaped from wood using knives and other cutting tools available to the craftsperson doing the work. The carved items were functional rather than decorative, though some care was taken to make them pleasant to look at and comfortable to use in daily activities. The winter carving produced items needed for household use or items that could be traded for other goods when markets resumed in spring and travel became possible again. Repairing tools and equipment during winter prepared them for use when spring work began and when functional tools would be needed immediately without time for repairs. Sharpening blades and replacing broken handles and fixing damaged metal parts occupied time during winter days when such work could be done indoors or in sheltered areas. The repairs were careful and thorough, as poorly repaired tools would fail during busy seasons when their use was critical and when there was no time to make proper repairs again. Winter repairs meant spring work could proceed without delays caused by equipment failures that could have been prevented with adequate maintenance. Making rope from twisted plant fibers provided cordage needed for tying and binding and for various other purposes around the household and in field work. The rope making required prepared fibers that had been processed during autumn and stored for use during winter when time was available for this work. The twisting was done by hand or with simple tools that spun the fibers together under tension to create strong rope from weak individual strands. The finished rope was coiled and stored until needed for specific icy tasks that required its use in the coming seasons ahead. Children during winter helped with indoor tasks and learned skills they would need as adults working in the household and in the fields outside. Boys learned to carve wood and to repair tools, while girls learned to spin thread and to sew garments and to prepare food for meals. The learning was informal and happened through observation and participation in the work being done by adults who corrected mistakes and demonstrated proper techniques. Winter provided time for this learning, as the pace of work was slower and adults could take time to teach without the pressure of urgent field work demanding their full attention. Stories told during winter evenings entertained and educated children and adults who gathered near the fire after the day's work was finished and before sleep. The stories preserved history and passed along moral lessons and provided social bonding through shared experience of hearing the same tales repeatedly over many winters. The storytellers were often elderly people who remembered stories from their own childhood and who had the time and inclination to tell them to younger generations gathered around. The stories were rarely written down and existed only in the memories of those who heard them and retold them to others in their turn. Religious observance continued throughout winter, with church attendance on Sundays and on holy days that marked important events in the religious calendar followed by the community. The church services provided structure to the week and brought people together for worship and for social interaction that broke the isolation of winter life. Sermons delivered by the priest reminded people of their religious duties and of proper behavior according to church teaching that governed many aspects of daily life. The services were conducted in Latin, which few understood, but participation was required regardless of comprehension of the words being spoken by the priest at the altar. Prayer was a regular part of daily life for most people who believed in the power of prayer to affect outcomes in their lives and in the world. Prayers were offered for good weather and for successful harvests and for protection from disease and from other dangers that threatened survival. The prayers reflected dependence on divine intervention in matters beyond human control and expressed hope that proper observance would result in favorable outcomes. Morning and evening prayers were common in households where religious practice was taken seriously as part of maintaining good relations with the divine powers that controlled life and death. Fasting during Lent required abstaining from meat and from other foods considered luxuries during the 40 days before Easter arrived each spring. The fasting was observed despite the difficulty it created during late winter when food supplies were already low and hunger was common. Religious obligation overrode personal comfort, and people fasted as required by church law even when doing so increased their suffering significantly. Breaking the fast at Easter brought celebration and relief and marked the end of winter's privations as spring approached with its promise of renewed food supplies from fields and gardens. Sickness during winter was more common as people lived in close quarters inside houses where diseases spread easily from person to person without ventilation or separation. Colds and coughs and fevers affected many people during winter months when cold and damp conditions weakened bodies already stressed by limited food and by the demands of surviving in difficult circumstances. Treatment consisted of rest and of herbal remedies that sometimes helped and sometimes had no effect on the illness being treated. Many people recovered but some did not, and deaths during winter were accepted as unfortunate but not unusual occurrences in the normal course of life. Days during winter were short and darkness came early in the afternoon when work had to stop because seeing clearly was no longer possible. The early darkness meant long evenings inside the house sitting near the fire until sleep came and ended the day's activities. The evenings were quiet as people were tired from the day's work, even though winter work was less strenuous than summer field labor. Conversation was limited and people sat in silence or spoke briefly about simple matters that required little thought or discussion between household members present. Fire in the hearth provided the only light and heat in the house during evening hours when darkness filled the interior space. The fire burned lower as the evening progressed and less fuel was added to conserve stored wood for the remainder of winter. The dimming light made seeing difficult and most detailed work stopped when the fire no longer provided adequate illumination for such tasks. People moved closer to the fire as it burned down to stay warm in the cooling house where cold air settled near the floor. Sleep came earlier during winter than during summer when longer days and warmer weather allowed staying awake later into the evening hours. Going to bed meant moving to sleeping areas and arranging blankets for warmth through the night when the fire would burn down to embers. The sleeping areas were cold and uncomfortable until body heat warmed the bedding and created a tolerable environment for rest through the dark hours. Morning would come slowly as winter dawns were late and gradual compared to summer mornings when light appeared earlier and more quickly. Waking in winter darkness was difficult as the cold house provided little incentive to leave the relative warmth of bedding and blankets that had been warmed during the night. The necessity of starting the fire and beginning the day's work forced people to rise despite their reluctance to face the cold air. Starting the fire from preserved embers was the first task and was accomplished quickly to begin warming the house for the day ahead. Once the fire was burning, people could dress and prepare for the limited work that winter days allowed before darkness returned in the early afternoon. Morning routines during winter were similar to routines during other seasons but were compressed into shorter periods because of limited daylight available for work. Eating and preparing for the day's tasks happened quickly so that work could begin as soon as light permitted, seeing adequately for the tasks requiring attention. The work might be indoors or might require going outside briefly to tend animals or to bring in firewood from storage areas near the house. The cold made outdoor work uncomfortable and people returned inside as soon as possible to continue work near the fire where warmth made working conditions more tolerable. Midday during winter came when the sun reached its highest point, which was much lower in the sky than during summer months when the sun climbed overhead. The lower sun meant less warming and shorter periods of adequate light for working outside or for detailed work inside requiring good visibility. Eating the midday meal happened during the brightest part of the day when light was best for seeing what was being consumed. The meal was simple and similar to meals eaten during other seasons, with bread and whatever other foods were available from stored supplies remaining from autumn harvest. Afternoon during winter was brief as the sun descended quickly toward the horizon and darkness approached by mid-afternoon in the depths of winter. Work continued as long as light permitted but stopped when seeing clearly became impossible without artificial light from fire or lamps. The shortened afternoon meant less time for accomplishing tasks and meant that work planned for the day often had to be continued the next day when light returned. The limitation was accepted as part of winter life and people adapted their expectations to match what was possible during the short dark days of the season. Evening came early during winter and brought an end to work that required good light for seeing what was being done with hands and tools. The evening routine began earlier than during summer and lasted longer as darkness extended from mid-afternoon until morning light returned many hours later. The long dark period was filled with indoor tasks that could be done by firelight or with sitting near the fire without working when no pressing tasks required attention. The sitting allowed rest and recovery from the day's exertions and provided time for the social interaction that helped maintain household cohesion during the long confinement of winter months together. Darkness during winter seemed oppressive as it dominated each day with only a few hours of daylight breaking the long periods of night. The darkness affected mood and energy as people struggled with the lack of light and the cold that accompanied it throughout the season. Spring was anticipated eagerly as the time when days would lengthen and warmth would return and when outdoor work could resume in fields that had been frozen and dormant through winter. The anticipation helped people endure the difficulties of winter by reminding them that the season would end eventually and that life would improve with spring's return. Cold during winter varied from day to day, with some days merely uncomfortable and other days bitter and dangerous for anyone exposed outside without adequate protection. The coldest days kept people inside except for absolutely necessary tasks that could not be postponed without serious consequences for household survival. Animals suffered during extreme cold despite the shelter provided in barns and sheds near houses where they were kept during winter. Losses of animals during severe cold periods reduced household resources and made surviving until spring more difficult as each lost animal represented food or labor that would no longer be available. Snow during winter covered fields and roads and made travel between villages nearly impossible until thaw came and cleared the paths again. The snow isolated households and villages from outside contact and from markets where goods might be traded or purchased if access were possible. The isolation was complete during heavy snow periods and lasted until enough melting occurred to make travel feasible again for those who needed to go beyond the village. Most people remained in the village throughout winter and did not attempt travel that was dangerous and unlikely to accomplish anything worth the risk involved in attempting it during bad weather conditions. Wind during winter made the cold more penetrating and made outdoor work even more unpleasant than it would have been in still air at the same temperature. The wind blew through gaps in walls and around doors and shutters that did not close perfectly against their frames. Drafts inside the house made staying warm difficult even near the fire, which could not heat the entire space adequately when cold air was constantly entering through openings. Blocking drafts with cloth or with additional materials stuffed into gaps helped but could not eliminate the problem entirely, as houses were not built to be completely airtight against winter winds. Ice formed on water containers inside the house during the coldest nights when the fire burned too low to maintain temperature above freezing throughout the interior space. The ice had to be melted before water could be used for drinking or for cooking during the morning when the fire was rekindled and began warming the house. Wells and streams froze during cold periods and water had to be obtained by melting snow or ice collected and brought inside for this purpose. The difficulty of obtaining water during frozen periods added to the challenges of winter survival when basic tasks became more time-consuming and difficult to accomplish without the resources normally available during other seasons. Hunger during late winter increased as stored food supplies diminished and as the remaining supplies had to be rationed more carefully to last until spring. The rationing meant eating less than would satisfy hunger and meant going to bed hungry on many nights during the worst period before spring arrived. Children suffered particularly as their growing bodies needed more food than was available from the limited supplies remaining in household stores. Parents reduced their own consumption to provide more for children who needed food for growth and development that could not be postponed without causing permanent harm to their health and to their future capacity for work and survival. Spring returned eventually, as it always did after the long, cold months of winter had passed, and the cycle continued into another year. The return of warmth and light brought renewed activity to the village, where people emerged from their houses to begin the work that would occupy them through another growing season. Fields that had been frozen and empty during winter needed plowing and planting again as they had needed in previous springs before this one. The work began when conditions allowed and proceeded through familiar steps that had been performed many times in years past by the same people in the same fields. Seeds were placed in soil that had been prepared by plowing and by breaking up the winter's compaction that had formed during months of freezing. The seeds would sprout and grow as they had grown before when conditions were right for their development into mature plants at harvest time. The sprouting happened below the surface where seeds absorbed moisture and began the process of growth that would continue through summer and into autumn. The growth was slow and not visible immediately but would eventually produce the green shoots that indicated successful germination had occurred in the planted fields. Work in the fields continued throughout the spring and summer as crops required attention to ensure they developed properly toward the harvest that would come eventually. Weeding removed unwanted plants that competed with crops for resources needed for growth and maturity before cutting time arrived in autumn. The weeding was repetitive and continued throughout the growing season as new weeds constantly appeared among the crop plants standing in rows. Each weed pulled was one less weed present, but more weeds always grew to replace those that had been removed from the soil between the planted rows. Days lengthened as spring progressed into summer and the sun climbed higher in the sky, providing more light and warmth for the growing crops. The longer days allowed more time for work in the fields where tasks accumulated and required attention throughout the season until harvest. The warmth made working outside more comfortable than during the cold months when outdoor labor was difficult and unpleasant in freezing conditions. The lengthening days and increasing warmth were welcomed after the long dark cold of winter that had confined people indoors for months without relief. Summer brought the peak of growth when crops matured and developed the grain that would be harvested when the time was right for cutting. The fields showed their fullest development during summer months when plants reached their maximum height and fullness before beginning the ripening process. Watching the crops during summer meant checking for signs of problems that might require intervention before harvest time arrived and revealed the results of the season's work. The watching continued throughout summer as part of the routine work that maintained the crops until they were ready for gathering in autumn. Harvest came in late summer and early autumn when grain had ripened and was ready to be cut and gathered from the fields. The cutting was done with sickles swung through the standing stalks in motions repeated many times as workers moved along rows clearing sections of field. The cut grain was bound into sheaves and left to dry before being transported to storage or threshing areas where processing would continue. The harvest occupied all available labor during the weeks when crops were ready and when weather conditions allowed the work to proceed safely and effectively. Autumn work followed harvest and included processing the gathered crops and preparing for the winter that would come after the autumn months passed into cold. Threshing separated grain from stalks and winnowing cleaned the grain of chaff that had mixed with it during the threshing process. The cleaned grain was stored in containers that protected it from moisture and from pests that would consume it if given the opportunity. The storage represented security for the household that had worked through the year to produce the food that would sustain them through another winter ahead. Winter returned as it had returned in previous years, bringing cold and darkness and the need to survive on stored food until spring. The return of winter meant a return to indoor work and to the waiting that characterized the season when outdoor work was impossible. Surviving winter meant enduring the cold and the hunger and the darkness that lasted from autumn until spring brought relief and renewal. The endurance was possible because it had been done before and would be done again in future years as long as life continued in the village. Life in the village continued through the cycles of seasons that repeated without significant change from one year to the next in the pattern. The patterns were familiar and people knew what to expect during each season and how to respond to the conditions that came with seasonal changes. The familiarity provided stability even as it created monotony in the repetition of similar work and similar conditions year after year. The stability was valued as it meant survival was possible through following established methods that had proven adequate for maintaining life in this place. Work continued as it had continued before, with the same tasks performed in the same ways using the same tools and methods. The continuation was unbroken except by the seasonal variations that required different specific tasks at different times of the year. The basic pattern remained constant, with plowing and planting and tending and harvesting following each other in the established sequence that defined the agricultural year. The sequence repeated and would continue to repeat as long as people remained in the village working the fields assigned to them. People lived as their parents had lived before them and as their children would live after them in the same village and in similar houses. The continuity extended across generations, with each generation repeating the patterns learned from the generation before and teaching those patterns to the generation that would follow. The repetition across generations created stability and preserved knowledge and skills necessary for survival in conditions that changed little over long periods of time. Houses stood where they had been built and would stand until they deteriorated beyond repair and needed replacement with new structures built in similar fashion. The houses sheltered families who lived and worked and raised children who would eventually take their places as adults working in the fields. The cycle of life in the houses paralleled the cycle of work in the fields, with both continuing through repetition of familiar patterns that sustained existence in the village. Fields were plowed and planted and tended and harvested as they had been in previous years and would be in future years. The fields produced crops that fed the people who worked them and provided seed for the next year's planting that would continue the cycle. The production was adequate in most years and inadequate in some years when weather or other conditions reduced yields below what was needed. The variation was accepted as part of the uncertainty that characterized agricultural life dependent on conditions beyond human control. Animals were cared for and provided products that supplemented the crops from fields and gardens near houses where people lived with their families. The animals required daily attention throughout the year regardless of season or weather conditions affecting other work that could be postponed. The care was provided because the animals were necessary for survival and for the work they performed in plowing fields and in providing food and other products. The animals continued from year to year through breeding that replaced animals that died or that were slaughtered for meat when needed. Children grew and learned and eventually became adults who performed the work their parents had performed before them in the same fields. The learning happened through participation and observation rather than through formal instruction separated from the work being taught. The children who survived to adulthood took their places in the continuing cycle of work and life that maintained the village through generations of families living in the same location. The continuation was possible because each generation learned what was necessary from the generation before and passed that knowledge to the generation that followed. Life proceeded through the familiar patterns without significant change or interruption beyond the seasonal variations that had always characterized existence in the village. The patterns continued because they worked adequately for maintaining life and because alternatives were unknown or unavailable to people living in conditions that offered limited choices. The continuation was simply how life was lived in the village where ordinary people worked and survived through repetition of established methods that had sustained their ancestors and would sustain their descendants in the years to come.